Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Future Governance Forum event to launch its new report, Into Power, the Conservative Party's 2010 Transition from Opposition to Government. I'm Anoosh Chakelian, Britain editor of The New Statesman and host of the New Statesman podcast, and I'll be chairing today's panel. For those of you who don't know, the Future Governance Forum is a new, progressive, non-profit and non-partisan think tank that aims to build the intellectual and practical infrastructure needed for national renewal and the revival of progressive government in the UK, shaping a new operating model for how the country works across national, devolved, regional and local government. A general election will take place at some point in the next 11 months in the UK. On current polling, there's a strong chance that the Labour Party will win power from the incumbent Conservatives. Should that happen, it will be just the third time in the last 40 years that we'll have experienced the transition of power from one party to another. To shine a light on how to make this transition work, FGF's Into Power series is looking at where lessons can be learned. Its first report, which came out in February, looked at what UK opposition parties could learn from recent elections in Australia and the US. And today, for the second report in this series, we're looking back to 2010, the last time power changed hands from one governing party to another in the UK. To give us insight into that process, I'm delighted to be joined by our brilliant panel today. Phil Tinline, author of the report launching today and a policy associate at FGF. He's also the author of The Death of Consensus, 100 Years of British Political Nightmares, and from 2002 to 2023, worked for BBC Radio, producing and presenting documentaries about political history. Francis Maude. Lord Maude is a senior British political figure and former minister. His career spans 3 governments, 4 decades, and multiple continents. Having had his first ministerial post under Margaret Thatcher, his ministerial career culminated in his position as cabinet minister in 2010 to 2015. Ayesha Hazarika. Baroness Hazarika was a special advisor to Gordon Brown, Harriet Harman, and Ed Miliband from 2007 to 2015. Her first book, Punch and Judy Politics, An Insider's Guide to Prime Minister's Questions, was published in 2018. And she's also an award-winning stand-up comedian. And Nick Macpherson. Lord Macpherson was Permanent Secretary of the Treasury from 2005 to 2016, leading the department through the financial crisis and the subsequent period of banking reform and fiscal consolidation. I'm going to come to Phil first to talk us through the headline findings from his report before asking Francis, Ayesha and Nick for their reflections on the issues his report raises. And then we'll open up into a broader discussion. And I'd like to take as many questions as possible from the audience. So please start putting your questions into the Q&A function anytime you like, whenever you think of one. And let me know if they're intended for any specific panelists as well, and I'll make sure I put it to them. And we'll be wrapping up by 1:30. So first of all, over to you, Phil.
Thank you. So there's only been one transition from one governing party to another in the last quarter century. So it seemed like a useful idea to look at what we can learn from the last time we went through this process, just in case anything of that kind happens in the near future. What I didn't do is look at the formation of the coalition. I looked at the Conservative Party specifically moving into power. And I think the 2 main things I found, I suppose, were that at a departmental level, the preparations were thorough and businesslike. Prospective ministers were briefed, Prospective ministers were briefed by those with more experience. There was the development of business plans, which were checked over by the Shadow Chief Secretary, and that gave a sort of clear set of signals which could be taken into the access talks with civil servants for what the priorities were for the first phase of government. I think it's fair to say, though, that the overall purpose of the government became somewhat uncertain in the 5 years of Cameron's tenure as leader of the opposition. Initially, there was a lot of talk about repairing the social fabric, about the big society. But of course, when the financial crisis happened in 2008, that presented a rather different imperative to cut the deficit. And I don't think those 2 things were ever quite integrated. Indeed, Cameron himself has said that he thinks that one reason they didn't win a majority in 2010 was that they went into an election with a rather ambiguous pitch offering, as he put it, the big society and austerity. When people went into office, there's a whole bunch of smaller experiences which are easy to miss but important to think about. Everything from whether or not people were sure about whether they were going to sit, to the appointment of special advisors, the impact of initial media pressure for the first time in government, one advisor told me, left people looking pale and drained, physically shocked. People are dispersed across Whitehall. Suddenly you're in the different departmental cultures. You're not all one tight team. But there were many measures that were taken to ameliorate that and keep control, particularly the 8 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. meetings that happened daily, which seemed to have been a really important way to maintain continuity and coherence. And then there was the question of getting rid of old institutions and creating new ones. And there was the winnowing out of the policy unit and the fairly rapid disappearance of the strategy and delivery units in number 10, which I think was eventually concluded to be something of a mistake, not least by Cameron, particularly with the delivery unit. But on the other hand, there were the creation of new institutions, which generally seemed to go very well. So the National Security Council literally met on the first day. You had the Office of Budget Responsibility, and you had the emergence sort of organically of the Quad, which I think has a lot of lessons for today. Then there were specific early reform drives. Obviously, you had the approach to cutting the deficit, which Nick will talk about with far greater authority than me. But from my outside impression, there was but not only a clear sense of priority there, but also a clear understanding from the key people involved of how power works. And Francis was working on improving the efficiency of procurement and finding savings. And that seemed to work rapidly and efficiently. I think you can contrast that with the other earlier goal of the big society, where the sense of priority and of how power worked was perhaps less clear, and that led to that having not quite as much success in achieving its objectives, let's say. In education, you had interesting contrary examples of how going quickly can work very well or not so well, with the Academies Bill, which became the Academies Act very, very rapidly before the summer recess. That led to the first schools becoming academies by September of that same year, within 4 months, which I think flabbergasted David Bell, the Permanent Secretary I spoke to, about just how quickly they'd managed to achieve that. On the other hand, the Building Schools for the Future programme being cut back was done at great speed, and that led to unforced errors, embarrassing corrections to announcements in the Commons having to be made. DWP, Work and Pensions, had a minister who had not been the shadow spokesperson and indeed had a central policy that was not in the manifesto, but actually had quite wide cross-party support of simplifying the benefit system as universal credit. The problem there was that it was a complex process, a hugely complex reform, which was having to take place at the same time as austerity, which perhaps unfairly I think of as slightly like trying to fix the car while you drive to the hospital, which eventually works but is kind of tricky en route. Talking of hospitals, as then the NHS reforms, which unlike those other two have largely been reversed, and we can talk perhaps more about what happened with those. So the lessons that I extrapolate from this, which I'll keep super brief because time is ticking, are basically under 4 headings. The first is purpose. It is well to decide why you want to be in government in the first place. It is a fundamentally horrible experience in many respects. It's worth knowing exactly why you're there, agreeing on that, and having a clear story you can tell the public about why you want to go in, what needs to change, and where you want to go. Following on from that, I think it's worth having a sort of theory of power, understanding where power lies, not only for your own benefit, but also so that civil servants are clear on who really holds power. But that also applies outside in the country as well. There will be people who disagree with you and want to stop you delivering your democratic mandate. It's worth thinking about who they are and working out how you can tackle that without undue conflict. There's then the question of pace. Certain things, as with the Academies Bill, are possible and perhaps necessary to do quickly, to signal momentum, to signal the government can make real change. If you try that with other things, particularly complex reform, that can become sticky. There are 2 different things you can do there, I think. One is to start going very sort of gently and slowly, just because it's a complex process that's going to take time procedurally. I mean, if Labour chooses to tackle social care, for example, it might be worth thinking of starting on day 1, but going very slowly, maybe over even more than 1 term. There's another kind of slowness as well, though, I think, which is where you try and bring the public with you, but you can only do that going so far at a time. We could perhaps talk about examples from the first Thatcher term on that. And then finally, just a simple question of pressure. Being in opposition is not the same as being in government. One advisor said it was like going from working in a small business to working in the biggest organisation in the country. Many more stakeholders to cajole and persuade and consult and win over, and so on. And you get dispersed, as I was saying before, across government. Trying to find ways to stay connected is very important. But there are things you can, excuse me, there are things you can do to be ready for this. You can try and understand the department that you're going to be running. You can also, if you're the leader of the opposition becoming prime minister, you can keep people in their shadow posts. So the work they've done on that score isn't wasted, you can start to build relationships in the access talks, and you can aim for a kind of balance between trust and skepticism, which I think is hard to achieve perhaps, but very well worth aiming for. And finally, you can be ready to exploit crises, and I think you do that by having a sense, as I say, of your overriding purpose.
Thank you so much, Phil. That was a great overview. And I'll go to Francis next.
Well, look, it's a great piece of work and incredibly important. We now seem to be in this period of kind of long electoral cycles. And so almost by definition, you have people coming into government who have little experience of it, or relatively few. I was one of the few coming into government in 2010 who'd been a minister before. And so it's really important to catalogue these lessons. In the work we did preparing for government, which I led, our mantra really was the Eisenhower dictum. It isn't the plans that matter, it's the planning. And the work that you do, understanding what are the issues. We know that no plan survives first contact with reality. And obviously the fact that each shadow minister had a plan in preparation was slightly thrown up in the air because it turned into a coalition. And we had a bunch of ministers coming in, Lib Dems, who had no conception that they were likely to be in government. But the fact that there was a plan which was capable of being adapted to reflect the coalition agenda was actually incredibly helpful. And I think they would say they found that incredibly helpful because it could be quite rapidly adapted. I don't quite agree with Phil's view that the purpose was unclear. Until the crash happened, our approach in opposition was to say that we would share the proceeds of growth between better public services and tax cuts. Then suddenly the crash happened and there were no proceeds of growth. And so the focus then inevitably had to be on austerity and fiscal retrenchment and consolidation. But the idea of the big society was consistent throughout, and the idea, and it is sort of nicely in balance: smaller state, bigger society. And we did do quite a lot of things. I led that work on big society, creating Big Society Capital, the world's first social investment bank, a whole lot of other things, public service mutuals, a whole lot of things which did reflect a different approach to collective endeavor, voluntary collective endeavor. One of the lessons I took from it was that when you're in opposition, and this is something I really think really important for Labour to reflect on, you make a lot of commitments which are made for political purposes, for it's kind of it's performative. George Osborne made a number of commitments which were there really to strike an attitude and to be a means of attacking Labour, particularly on waste. So committed to cutting spending on consultants, on marketing and advertising. And then he had this paper, which we both signed actually, called It's Your Money, which said that in order to improve financial management, all the finance directors across government would report directly into the Treasury. Now, the first two of those things I took, and we turned into real-time spend controls, and we cut the government's overall spend on consultants by 2/3. We cut the spend on advertising and marketing by nearly 3/4 and made it much more effective because it was for the first time able to be kind of centrally coordinated. So you didn't have competing campaigns. The thing about the finance directors didn't happen. And that was a great pity. The efficiency program we ran, and Labour, if they win that later this year, Labour will have to do the same. And there is huge scope to save money. There are huge efficiency savings that are available now. We saved cumulatively over 5 years, £52 billion, essentially from the running costs of government. And if that thing that we committed to in It's Your Money had been implemented, we could have saved another 10 billion, I guess, because it would have given us so much better visibility into what the money was being spent on. Labour have committed to creating an office of value for money, and that's a really good thing to do. But you need actually to take it and make it work in reality from day one, because Whitehall responds to signals, and you need to be in a position to send those signals really quickly. Just one final thing. the benefit of the planning was that we were able to start doing things really, really quickly. And there is a tendency when you come into government that officials, for very proper good reasons say, well, of course, you'll want to have a white paper and a green paper and, you'll need legislation. And the things we were doing, particularly on public service mutuals, we said, no, we'll just do it. Find some examples which we will hothouse and turn into successes, and we'll build a program out of that. So never underestimate the benefits, the momentum benefits of doing things, even quite small things, and making things happen, because the signal not only to the public, to the voters, but also the demonstration effect within government. So renegotiating contracts, once we eventually worked out, because there was no central data on who the biggest suppliers to government were, we renegotiated those contracts, a load of contracts, and we saved, 800 million pounds cash savings in that first short financial year. And the effect of that within government, the signal that sent, was very powerful, because actually, first of all, people said, okay, maybe these guys mean it. Secondly, okay, maybe you can do these things that we kind of assumed in a slightly defeatist way couldn't be done. So those are my initial reflections, but great piece of work, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis, for those reflections. And we'll move on to Aisha now for the Labour perspective of that 2010 transition.
Well, of course, the 2010 Labour transition didn't go so well for the Labour Party. Obviously, it was like kind of transitioning the wrong way from power. But I suppose my reflections are, having been, I was a civil servant from 1997, and then I became a special advisor. So I kind of become a junior civil servant at the point where Labour has, taken over in 1997. And then I'm a special advisor as Labour is losing power. I'd like to think I'm not the correlation or causation of this happening. But I suppose when I contrast the two moments, particularly having been a civil servant and then having been a special advisor, I think it's a great presentation from Phil. And I think your kind of 4 points about, why you're in government, understanding power, pace and scale, and the fact it's very different from opposition, all of that is incredibly true. And I think that when I was a civil servant in 1997, when just shortly after the sort of Labour administration took charge, I think I was really struck, and many civil servants at the time, I was in the press office of the then department called MAF, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, and it had been at the tail end of the BSE crisis, and you really saw a government department that had lost a lot of confidence in itself. It had been at the absolute eye of the storm of this kind of terrible sort of public health scare. But what was fascinating is watching a kind of Labour operation arrive, which was so ambitious, and it had such a clear sense of confidence about how it wanted to change government at sort of every level. And I was working in the press office at the time, and I remember the kind of senior press communications secretaries and things like that just being absolutely terrified when they went in. They were summoned in to see Alistair Campbell and the rest of the team on a sort of daily and weekly business. And I remember one of our kind of senior kind of comms people coming back and clutching this piece of paper. It was like a grid, and he was like holding up, and he was like, they're making us do a grid, and how is this even possible? Are we meant to be like time lords that we can look into the future and see what kind of how do we know what story's coming up 2 weeks on Wednesday? How is that even possible? But of course, the Labour Party had this machine of the grid of, right, no, we are not going to be victims of the news. We're going to learn how to control the news agenda. We are going to schedule in stories. And I feel like that was such a good example of Labour in 1997 coming in with, obviously they had a kind of vision for the country, but like a real kind of vision for the machinery of government and all that side of it, from the kind of decision making with the number 10 delivery unit right through to the comms operation as well. And I kind of feel that when the 2010 happened, of course, it was a very unusual situation, as Maud has alluded to. I actually think that the Conservatives did have quite a clear message in the run-up to 2010. I remember it well because we were getting spanked by it on a daily basis by a very youthful, thrusting David Cameron and a very ambitious, muscular George Osborne. But of course, you know, life threw a curveball in the coalition, and that definitely changes your plan for government massively, because to that question of, you know, the theory of power and understanding it, that is completely shaken up when two partners suddenly come together. So I think to be fair to them, that's a very, very different situation to be in. And as Maud said, the Liberal Democrats were less than kind of like competition winners in the whole thing, you know, slightly sort of clueless about what was going on. But I do think what we did as we lost power is really interesting. So I think when you talk about transition of government, and you always think about the people who acquire power, but as you're transitioning, you are also the side losing power. And I think how you lose power is as important as how you gain power in many ways. It comes as no state secret that we could see the writing was on the wall in sort of probably kind of, you know, after the expenses scandal, and, you know, you have that feeling in your waters, as they say in Scotland, where you know power is slipping away, and suddenly you can't do anything right. You know, it's just disaster after disaster. But I think even though we were not speaking about it openly as we had our last kind of months and years in government, we knew it was coming. And I think everybody that was still involved made a decision that we wanted to leave as honourably as possible. We didn't want to burn down the house for the next people. We didn't want to just rip everything up. We did sort of think, right, if this is going to be our last year in power, what do we want to do in that time? What's the legacy legislation we want to leave to help people? For example, I was very much involved in the Equality Act, which started out as a consolidation exercise, but actually we decided that we wanted this to be a really flagship piece of legislation to show, you know, this is what a Labour government should do. But we also didn't want to kind of destroy the civil service. We wanted to leave whoever took over with something which was good and which was working and had a sense of purpose. And I feel kind of sadly that's not kind of happening at the moment, and there's many reasons for that. But as everything feels like it slightly falls apart, there is a feeling that the kind of core machinery of government has been really hollowed out. The civil service has been really hollowed out as well. And I suppose I would just end on this, which is, for an incoming Labour government, it's a very different beast, as Phil referred to, being in opposition. And I think Labour's done an extraordinary job. You just think Keir Starmer took over just 4 years ago when the Labour Party was really at its lowest ebb. Many of us, including myself, I was a great fan of Keir Starmer. I thought there's no chance he's going to be able to even be in, you know, as a decent kind of opposition party, let alone be this point in the polls. But when you're an opposition party in these very unusual circumstances where everything is going wrong for the government, it feels quite easy. There's not to say Labour is doing a good job, but it feels easy. You can just slag everything off because everything is going wrong. It's like kind of shooting fish in a barrel. But for the Labour Party, very soon, they are going to inherit everything that they are slagging off. And it is much easier to be on the outside slagging everything off than to be on the inside. And when you come into government, the sheer volume of stuff, the amount of paper in your red box every night that you have to keep on top of, because you cannot afford to let that backlog build up, the number of people you have to consult with. You can't just pick up the phone to your mate anymore who, you know, you've known since the dawn of time and you've grown up through the Labour Party. Everything has to be done through cabinet committees. There's so much paperwork. There's so much bureaucracy as well. And of course, you also have there's so much more scrutiny upon you as well. So I think I'd probably end on this, which is, when you enter government, you've got to bring the civil service with you. You are idiots to go in and think that the civil service is against you. Most civil servants are really decent people. They work really hard. And do you know what? They really want to have a proximity to power, and they want to have a proximity to be part of a team that is delivering good things, because that's good for them. They want to, when they have their dinner parties or hangouts, say, yeah, I was part of Frances Maud's team. We did really, really good work. I'm really proud of this piece of legislation we put through. So bringing the civil service with you is really important. Not making an enemy of them is just so counterproductive. It's just so counterproductive. Having said that, though, it's really important not to go native as well. It's really important not to sort of outsource all your critical thinking and problem solving to your private office and your senior civil servants as well. If you want to get something done in government, you have to really oversee it as well. And sometimes, yes, of course, you have to pay respect to the systems, which are really important. But you also sometimes have to remember that you have your own contacts in politics. Don't become distant from your cabinet colleagues. Don't become distant from your advisors. Your advisors should not become distant. Don't sort of set yourself up as so part of your department, you almost become adversaries to people who you were friends and colleagues with. You're all on the same team. Sometimes what can happen is when you start pitching for funding or legislation coming through, it gets very geared up to be one department versus another department in terms of striking things down, and it becomes quite a competition. And it's really important, particularly as a new government going in, to remember that you are a team and you will all kind of succeed collectively if sometimes you help other departments get something over the line. So yeah, they're just my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha. And I'm glad you ended on that note, because now we have the civil servants perspective with Nick. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much. And my first bit of advice is that Sir Keir and Sue Gray should sign Phil up to help organise the transition, because I thought his paper was a model of clarity. And actually, I don't have a huge amount to add to it. I mean, I think the first and most important point is the incoming government needs clarity on its priorities. I mean, that's easy to say, rather more difficult to do. If you wait till you get into government to decide your priorities, what your priorities are, you're almost certainly going to end up being totally behind the curve. And with that in mind, really, I think picking up on Frances and Aisha's points, you kind of, the ideal approach, in my view, is to have some early announcements which will define the government and be completely uncompromising, very focused. You need, in the first few weeks, to have policies, structures, and so on, which will show that this time it's different. And I saw that in '97 with Bank of England independence, saw it again in 2010 with the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, but also the in-year spending cuts. And that can buy you time because there will be some issues which genuinely, picking up on Aisha's point, you do want to bring people with you, either commissioning a review, having a consultation, or even going back sort of 40 years, having a royal commission or whatever, because you can't solve everything in the first few weeks. And there are sort of tedious things like the legislative program. So some things take longer. The challenge there is actually when you push things further out, there's a terrible temptation never to address those issues at all. Social care comes to mind. There was indeed a royal commission in '97, and the Cameron-Clegg government commissioned my old friend Mr. Dilnot to do a review of social care. I think we're still waiting for that to be implemented. So that matters. I think, and here, just coming back to no doubt the sort of unimaginative and conservative approach of the civil service, I wouldn't feel obliged to abolish and trash everything the last government did. I know Frances Maud won't agree on probably on this, but actually, I thought the delivery unit was quite a good institution under Michael Barber, and having delivery plans which forced departments to focus on what they were trying to achieve was a rather effective way of getting things done. Tearing all that up in 2010 and substituting so-called departmental business plans actually, I think, led to a lack of momentum rather than the contrary. And on institutions, just be careful about abolishing them. I wonder what the point of abolishing the Audit Commission was, quite frankly. I think we have missed out in terms of assessing the performance of local authorities and so on as a result. Just digressing briefly to, those civil servants are listening, really important to understand what the incoming government is about, what it wants to do, but also to pick up actually how it likes to work, because you simply cannot expect people who work very effectively in opposition, who perhaps have never been ministers, to settle into a form of working which the previous administration has perfected or not over a decade or more. I remember that in '97, Ken Clarke had been a minister for 18 years. He perfected being a minister in terms of knowing precisely how he liked to work and so on. And the new Labour guys just had a very different style and approach indeed, and that actually we should have been quicker to understand what that would entail. Similarly, even in 2010, although George Osborne had been in government as a special advisor, this was a young, dynamic team of people coming in, and you kind of have to realize that the world has changed. And just to, and again, I think civil servants tend to be a bit too literal. They get obsessed with a manifesto, for example. It's actually it's definitely worth in the run up to the election, if you're in so-called access talks, looking for the implicit signals, the things which aren't said, the way things are said, the emphasis, and so on. All of which requires a degree of emotional intelligence, which was probably beyond me. But the final point I guess I'd make, which as a former Treasury official, I suppose I would expect to make, is it's really important that the centre of government is joined up and is working well. And look, it's a job of the number 10 and Cabinet Office to set the agenda, to determine priorities. It's the job of the Treasury to ensure those priorities add up, whilst at the same time, ideally, encouraging growth in the economy rather than detracting from it. And I've seen numerous regimes. Some work very well at the centre, some work less well. But if you can start as you mean to continue, I think 2010 was a good example, actually, because of the Cameron-Osborne relationship. What made it more complicated, as Francis Maude alluded to, was the coalition, because we were expecting to have Phil Hammond as the Chief Secretary, who had worked extensively with Francis Maude on plans, for example, on finance, the finance function and so on. But Danny Alexander just changed all that. And which I guess is my final point. You really have to be ready for anything. Of course, you want the shadows to be appointed as secretaries of state, but generally things happen. And even if Labour get in with a massive majority, I'm quite certain there will be some fiddling around the edges of the administration. So you just have to factor that in.
Brilliant, thank you. Reshuffle rumours already. Thanks, Nick. And thanks so much for all of our panelists' initial insights. It's brilliant. I want to ask, we've got loads of audience questions, so I want to make sure that we give you all a chance to ask those. But I just want to ask my own question first of all. And you've all touched on different lessons for the potential incoming Labour government. What's your sense of where Labour is at this stage in the cycle in terms of how prepared they are, especially compared to where the Conservatives were in the equivalent time in 2010? I think I'll go to Phil first, because we haven't heard from you, Phil, in a while.
I think it's curiously varied. I mean, I think there are, and it's not necessarily varied on the basis of the sort of length of tenure or the amount of experience of shadow ministers. It's possibly partly to do with, you know, the complexity and difficulty of the brief. But my impression is that there is still plenty of work to be done. And that there, particularly given what Nick was saying about making, you know, early announcements and some of the things I was getting at about, you know, going in with preparation. I think, you know, if this government's, you know, if one of this government's, you know, great signature, if one of the Labour potential government's great signature sort of first steps is going to be on housing, you know, there seems to be still quite a lot of work left to do on that, particularly as it's the kind of reform that, you know, isn't going to deliver by, you know, you're not going to have houses at the end of the first 100 days. I mean, even Macmillan, you know, who went super quick, you know, still took several years to deliver what he delivered. So I think there's that. But I don't know. I mean, the others will probably know more than me about this, really. I think it's partly just the kind of process I was trying to sort of allude to of sort of, it's hard thinking your way into what you're going to be dealing with. I mean, Aisha's point jumped out at me that, you know, just the sheer volume of paper. I think it's very, very hard to get used to that. And to be honest, I think, you know, the more conversations that are had, and this is something I know Nick organised for people in the Treasury, the more conversations they have with people who just had, you know, that sort of brutal experience, the better. And I think conversations between, you know, special advisors who are working with Labour now and are laser focused on going into government with special advisors who work for the Conservatives would be very useful. So I think there's plenty of work still to be done.
Great, thank you. And I'll go to Francis next on how prepared you think Labour is at this stage.
Well, I mean, I'm not well qualified to know, but I mean, I think they're doing lots. They've got Sue Gray in there. Sue is brilliant. Nobody knows more about how Whitehall works than she does. And you know, she worked for me. She's terrific, and they're very well served from that point of view. I hope what they're doing is looking at some of the recommendations that have been made about refashioning the centre of government. I mean, I made some recommendations in my civil service review late last year. The IFG, Institute for Government, have done the same. They haven't gone quite as far as me. They slightly drew back on a subject very dear to Nick Macpherson's heart, splitting the Treasury. But they said the Treasury has got one more chance to make proper control of public spending and collaboration with the centre work well. But creating a proper Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet is essential. Splitting the role, having a proper full-time head of the civil service, which we have never really had, is essential, and properly empowered as well, with real authority given and authority to drive the constant improvement and capability building of the civil service. You know, we do workforce planning in such a ludicrous way, where, you know, the Treasury controls pay, but the Cabinet Office controls or is meant to control shape, size, composition, capability, and this is no way to run an effective government machine. So I hope they will take that seriously. And these are things that can be done on day one of a new government, and that's pretty much the only time you can do these things. So I hope they're giving good thought to that. And then, I mean, I think that doing that work, that preparatory work, you know, the point Phil makes about housing, this is bloody difficult. You know, this isn't, governments have been grappling with this for decades and unsuccessfully. It is an easier thing for a Labour government to do than it is for a Conservative government, because, you know, the Conservative backbenchers are full of people like me who believe in theory that everything should be much more open and much more housing should be built, but actually, you know, represent constituencies which are deeply, deeply resistant to it. And it's hard. It's very hard. But Labour should actually, and that's a classic thing to do really quickly, If they win the election, they've got a good mandate, do it really quickly, spend some of that political capital you have. You never have more political capital than at the beginning of a government, and spend it on the things which are hard to do, but which will really make a difference. And so that's, I think, the advice I would give.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Aisha, what are your thoughts on where Labour's at compared to the Conservatives in 2010?
So I think it's a mixed picture for Labour. I mean, obviously the poll leads just being so big for such a long time has been both a blessing and a curse for Labour, because they have this real shot at power. I agree very much with Frances that getting Sue Gray in was absolutely brilliant. I know she's been doing a lot of work behind the scenes. However, having said that, it's really, really difficult to suddenly prepare for, you have just basically, the Labour Party has been this kind of small cottage sort of operation for so long in the wilderness of opposition. And suddenly, really just since the mini budget, so not that long ago, suddenly it's moved into this thing where actually you're going to be, taking over this big machine. So there's a lot of thinking going on, but I think there's probably a lot of panicking as well, because people forget that behind, the great confidence and the muscularity and the status of the Wes Streetings and the David Lammies and, everybody like, we're coming in to sort of rule the world. They've only really got a team of 2 or 3 people behind them who are really good people. They're quite junior. They're working every hour that God sends. Now, of course, the Labour Party is now inundated with offers of help. But when you have a really small base of staff, it's actually really difficult to manage all the offers of help and ideas that are coming in. So they've got this kind of slightly asymmetric situation where, from big business to entrepreneurs to the arts, everyone is coming at the Labour Party, do this, do that. I have got the magic bullet that's going to save this sector. And that's actually a lot to process when you still have a very, very small team of people. And of course, the money has only been flowing into the Labour Party recently in terms of funding and getting more people in place. So I think they are really straining every sinew, and they're thinking really, really hard about what to do. But it's very difficult to think that there's a fully fledged plan ready to go. Remember, the access talks have only really just begun. They haven't really got in and seen beneath the bonnet of the car. They haven't really even properly had a look at all the numbers. And of course, Nick will be better placed than anybody at this. But what do? We do know that there's still, despite how tight everything, there's still £20 billion of cuts that have to be coming down the track from sort of the last autumn statement. So all of this makes it very difficult. And I think that's why they've been wise to focus on sort of headline missions and not tie themselves into specific spending plans. But we saw what happened with the £28 billion on the Green Prosperity Plan. I think probably it was a bit naive to attach a figure to that too early, but that's the kind of pressure that they're going to be under. Just on Frances's point about kind of big machinery of government changes, and he's right, you're never more powerful than at the start of winning power, and it's sort of all gradually downhill from there. I would just be a bit cautious about too many big machinery of government changes. I think, to pick up on Nick's point, 1 or 2 symbolic things that make some kind of sense to the public is important. But I think too much of footering around with changing lots of internal things doesn't really mean much to the public, and it actually does take quite a lot of bandwidth away. I think the focus of Labour coming in is really in that first 100 days and beyond. Get some stuff done that actually, don't just do stuff to quicken the pulse of the Whitehall editor at the Financial Times. Do stuff that is actually good. Not that the Whitehall editor of the Financial Times is not an incredibly important person who must be showered with love, affection, and attention, but you've got to get some absolute hardcore consumer retail friendly changes done very, very quickly. I think the other thing as well is that the Labour Party is going to, I think, in a way which is different to the Conservative Party when they have won. The Labour Party is going to win in really unusual circumstances, in the sense that, if according to the polls, it's going to come in with a big majority, but there isn't going to be the feel-good factor that there was in 1997 because the world is a very different place. And literally on day one, they're going to have a really hostile press coming for them. And there's also going to be sections of the left who are going to be coming for the Labour Party. There's a lot of people on the left, particularly in the union movement and others, who are taking a vow of silence now. And their view is we're all going to kind of hold the line and hold our noses to get Labour into power and over the line. But day one, day two, I'm coming. I want to discuss about giving my workers a massive pay rise. I want to, talk about. So they are going to face so many pressures right from the beginning. So they just need to be really focused on the fact that there isn't going to be a kind of feel-good honeymoon period. It's going to be really tough right from the start.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And just quickly, Nick, on this, because I'm going to then move on to some of our great questions from the audience.
Yeah, look, I think I'm with Aisha. I really wouldn't do too much on machinery of government. It's nothing to do with the Treasury. I mean, look, if people want to break up the Treasury, that's fine. But I'd be slightly disappointed if they did do that. And Rachel Reeves seems to already have ruled it out. I think, look, I get a sense that there are some people in the shadow cabinet actually who've got serious ministerial experience, and Ed Miliband's been doing quite a lot on climate change preparations. I suspect Yvette has on Home Affairs, and John Healey, I think, is well placed to have a plan for defence. The problem, as everybody's alluded to, is that there isn't a huge amount of money. So I think you need. I mean, normally it's axiomatic on these changes of government that you have an emergency budget where you say that the last lot were hopeless and this buys you some time. The problem for the government is actually the emergency budget time will coincide pretty much with the budget, because you have to set out your plans for local government, I think, by mid-December. So I think the big issue, which I think Rachel Reeves and Starmer and others have got to think through, is how much do they try and solve everything in that December budget, and what things do they play longer? But if money is short, I think that budget is the time to do some serious revenue raising. And clearly that we don't yet know what those serious revenue raising plans are.
Great, thank you. And we've got two really good questions, one from Zoe Crowther and one from Melanie Field, who are asking similar questions about Labour's ideological purpose. So they pick up on the contradictions, Phil, that you mentioned between the Big Society project and austerity. And I know that Francis countered that view. But is there a risk that Labour has a similar ideological confusion? They talk a lot about fully costed policies, but voters still seem unsure of their central ideological message. I don't know who wants to come in on that one. Yeah, go for it, Phil.
Yeah, I think there is a risk, and I think it's for perfectly good reasons, because you don't want to go too far towards spending too much money, but equally, I think this is something that perhaps does need more focus. There is a risk on the other side of the equation as well. Nigel Farage is constantly talking about coming back. It is not beyond the bounds of possibility that voters who, voted Labour for a long time, then went to the Tories, disappointed with the Tories, give Labour one last go. If they don't really get much from voting Labour, that is not a risk-free political strategy, much as it may seem economically necessary. So I think that's where there's going to be quite a lot of pressure. And I think that's why I sort of keep talking about this idea of an overarching story, because if you have a story, as I think Margaret Thatcher did, for example, you may not have precise departmental policies, but if you've got a fundamental kind of way you want to change the country, then when you're faced with those sort of invidious decisions where there is no good option, which is what most of the government seems to me is about quite a lot of the time, then if you have a clear direction, if you have a clear vision of how life is going to get better, then it is much more possible, I think, to make those decisions and not just sound like you're kind of, worrying about money, but you're actually trying to do this to get the country to somewhere better, which will take some pain. And I think, looking back at the trajectory from 79 through, I think you can see that work very clearly. And I think that is something that, given that we have been through, over a decade of crises, the financial crisis is 16 years ago. You know, that is, it feels to me like this is much more of a 1979 moment actually in some ways than a 2010 one.
And Nick, I'd be interested to hear from you on this, because one of the people asking this question was a civil servant at the time of the previous Labour government. Do you think that it's sort of evident? You said in your opening remarks that it's useful to have priorities before you come in. Is it clear enough the purpose of this potential next Labour administration, what their priorities are yet?
No, I don't think it is totally clear, because they are quite rightly totally focused on winning, and in seeking to win, they're focusing on what's wrong with the current government rather than their sort of ideological purpose when they've taken office. So actually, I was going to say maybe it's more like 1974 than 1979, but we will see. I don't think that matters in itself, providing there's a plan and a compelling story around that plan. I mean, this may not play to Keir Starmer's strengths. He doesn't strike me as someone who wants to wax lyrical about some New Jerusalem. But he's going to have to at least come up with a story which can bind what the government does together.
Thank you. And we have a good question from James Carroll, who asks, and actually this is a good one, because I think you all mentioned this need to take the public with you. And he asks how to prime the public for substantial reform proposals before even coming into the government, but also sort of in the early days of once you're in government. What early steps must the next government take to improve how people receive its messages and are sort of brought along with you if you're trying to make radical reforms like the planning changes that Phil mentioned? Francis,
shall I have a go at that?
Yes, please.
I think there's a interest. I mean, it's a great question, and it's really important. And it goes back to Nick's point actually at the outset in his remarks, where he said, don't attack everything your predecessors did. The best reforms, the most effective reforms, are where you pick up something that the previous government has done and you amplify it. So Phil talked about how Michael Gove's school reforms had an impact very, very quickly. And what he was doing was actually in substance much more radical than the Blair reforms, but he picked up but he was able to say, well, this is just continuity. It's just continuity Blair. It was much more radical. Whereas, and I'd contrast that with what the approach on the health NHS reforms, which were much less successful. But actually, there was a way of doing that where if we had simply said, Tony Blair, with a lot of resistance from Gordon Brown, had created kind of foundation hospitals and this kind of thing, trusts and much more kind of independent operations within the NHS. So what Michael Gove did was to be more radical than the language, and what Andrew Lansley did was to talk very radical, but actually create something which was horrendously bureaucratic, and allowed the then head of the NHS England to overload it with massive kind of new entities and horrendous clutter, if you like, which both made it much less effective, but also kind of slowed it all down. And so you had all of the downside of looking like you were doing radical stuff to the NHS, which is always politically massively sensitive, without getting the benefit. And Michael Gove, it was exactly the reverse.
Thank you. And would anyone else like to come in on this challenge of taking the public with you if you're going to do big reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, that there will have to be huge reform, and to have good governance, you always have to have evolution. That's the way things should go. And I think it's quite interesting because I think one area you're already seeing a huge amount of pitch rolling being done about reform is Wes Streeting with the NHS. That is something that he has clearly decided to go early on, so that if he becomes health secretary, it's not going to come as a surprise. He just did a big piece in The Sun this week, almost having a go at what he classed as, middle-class lefties that were clutching their pearls over the use of privatisation to get waiting lists down. He's picked a bit of a fight with the BMA and others over, GPs and things like that. So I think that's quite an interesting example of already doing some of that sort of preparatory work. And I think the reform agenda is going to, I think when we look back, reform will actually be quite a defining hallmark of if there is this incoming Labour government, because things are going to have to be reformed because of the fiscal climate. But I think one thing that the Labour just has to be really, really careful about is you can only reform so much at once. Reform is actually really, really difficult to get right, as Francis has alluded to. You can't just raise everything to the ground. You have to become match fit at reforming things, and then you get better at it, and then you can do more. The other thing I think Labour has to be really, really careful about is framing an argument which it's money versus reform, because the best reform costs money. There is always an initial outlay with good reform, whether it's in capital, machinery, training, trained staff, skills, all of that. It kind of takes time and money to get good reform. So I think the reform agenda is going to be so important to Labour, but they've got to be careful about how they frame it.
Thank you. And we've had a number of people writing questions about the missions. So we know that Keir Starmer's plan is for a mission-led government. Anna Abila asks, are the 5 missions an effective framework to set a new government's purpose? And Michael Collins asks, how quickly did and will the new ministers go native and get captured by their departmental interests at the expense of this mission-led whole of government agenda? We've got a few minutes left, so perhaps Nick, I'll go to you first.
Well, I think the missions are a perfectly reasonable start, but they are at a level of generality, which I think requires them to be populated pretty quickly once taking office. And actually, like others, I think health reform, just because health is accounting for an ever-increasing proportion of public spending, if you don't tackle that early, then I think you're finished. I mean, one of the disappointing things of 13 years of Tory government is actually how little progress they have made on health reform, and I think Labour can do that. I mean, look, it's always tempting to think that sort of departments capture ministers, and I do take Aisha's point earlier that there's a risk you get holed up in your department, and I can remember Nigel Lawson once saying, much as he admired the Treasury, whenever he did anything radical, it wasn't the Treasury who was generating those ideas, it was him and the political people around him. And I think that is generally true. The civil service is not the most creative organization, but I would like to come back to how you get departments to work together. And I think one of the more effective mechanisms back in the early years of the century was public service agreements, which required government departments to work together because they were jointly or severally held. And actually creating that sort of governance does allow people to get out of their departmental box and think in a more cross-cutting way.
Can I just add a word on that? I mean, because I think it's a good approach. I mean, because what you unless you have this kind of broad cross-departmental approach on big programs, what you end up doing is slightly what the current government's been doing, which is constantly shifting the boundaries of departments to try and capture everything about net zero, for example, which you can't possibly do in one department. You just create an awkward boundary somewhere else. And so I think this approach is the right way to go, but they will find it really, really hard because the ancient Treasury theology dating back to Gladstone says that all budgets have to be given to a silo, to a vertical, to a single department, and that militates against creating this kind of sense of a cross-cutting budget around a task, around an outcome. And I think they will have a real argument with the Treasury, because I'm told, I mean, at the end of my review, after I published it, I think, I learned that Gordon Brown, who was, after all, an incredibly powerful, politically and personally, intellectually powerful chancellor, tried to do some of this and was told it was happening, and then it just didn't happen. I mean, the Treasury theology on this is very, very strong because they're convinced that money will leak away. Well, money leaks away anyway, and we're not very good at controlling spending in this country. But I think if Labour want to make this happen, they'll have some difficult times with the Treasury establishment.
Look, I don't think Treasury will be a problem on this. We did have cross-departmental budgets on things like criminal justice,
Tiny.
Well, it was a reasonable size, but we could do a lot more of it. And actually, this is what comes back. Look, if the Prime Minister is clear from day one, and Rachel Reeves is clear from day one, this is going to happen, the Treasury will have to find a way of making it work. That's how government works. So, and look, I know Francis Maude had a similar problem with the civil service, encountering resistance, but he actually did a rather good job in providing political leadership, which forced the civil service to respond. So it does require political leadership.
I hate so much to cut this discussion short, but we have come to the end of our time. Thank you so much to our brilliant panelists, and also to the audience for your excellent questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get through them all. And don't forget, you can read Phil's full report and a blog summarising its findings and everything else about FGF, including signing up to its newsletters at futuregovernanceforum.co.uk. And you can follow them on Twitter at FutureGovForum, and you can find them on LinkedIn as well. And today's report was the second of 2 so far, and there will be more to come in the Into Power series. So look out for those. Thank you, everyone.